Hi everyone, welcome to another one in the IGB webinar series, this time organized together with TransUnion. My name is Eva Bakun and I will be moderating today's webinar. Against what perhaps has been advertised, we just had a last minute change. So this webinar has been inspired and is also a follow-up to another one that we organized back in November as part of our digital consumer protection zone offering and aligned with the UK Safer Gambling Week. And back then we discussed together with Kindred Group, PAF and Be Better, the pros and cons of individualized versus blanket approaches to responsible gambling. Obviously, this is a very widely debated issue, and just really the sheer number of questions that we received during that webinar is a testimony to how discussed this topic is. Today we'll be taking a step further and actually look at how to apply that individualized, personalized approach to consumer and to consumer protection starting at that very early stage, onboarding stage, and what really that could or should look like from a customer perspective. So with us today, we have Ewout Wierda from Video Slots, who will be giving us more of a European perspective. Europe is obviously where the discussion takes center stage. Then connecting with us all the way from West Coast Canada, Brad Romano, who's representing a very advanced when it comes to consumer protection and online lottery in Canada, in British Columbia. That's British Columbia Lottery Corporation. And then back from UK, from Europe, Adam Hancocks from TransUnion, a company that, as I said, helped us develop this webinar, but is also helping operators with that onboarding process, and obviously also has access to a lot of information on consumer behavior when that onboarding happens. And my name is Eva Bakun. I'm the Director of Industry Insight and Engagement for Clarion Gaming. I have worked for Clarion Gaming for a number of years, and I also initiated the creation of the Consumer Protection Zone, which is a section of ICE show floor. We started it a few years ago, and I do hope that many of you have had a chance to visit it when live shows were allowed. This Consumer Protection Zone is fully dedicated to technology and innovation in responsible gambling and consumer protection. And most recently, as I said, we held its digital representation as well. So I'll be moderating this webinar. I just also wanted to encourage you all to put forward your question through the question functionality of the platform. Please do so throughout the webinar. I will be picking them up as we go along, but also we're going to leave a few minutes at the end of the session to address as many questions as we can. This webinar is also being recorded, which means that you will also be able to re-listen to it or share with your colleagues. So I mentioned the November webinar when we first talked about this individualized approach to responsible gambling. And back then, that particular webinar started with a quote coming from 2014 from Matthew Hill, back then the director at the Gambling Commission. And I believe you can see the quote in front of you on the presentation. I'm just going to read this for you right now. I think it just really sets the scene nicely for our discussion. So back then, Matthew Hill in 2014 said, "We believe that the way to make gambling regulation work is to shift the focus of the regulation away from the sort of blanket controls that underpin current gambling legislation, like limits on machine stakes and prizes and machine numbers, and tailoring it much more closely to individual gamblers. The idea is that you bear down hard on gambling-related harm, providing the help and the interventions for the people who really need it, while leaving a normal, safe gambling as untouched as possible and providing space for the industry to innovate and, yes, grow." So this is what was said in 2014, and now I do have to credit the discovery and addition of this quote to Dan Waugh from Regulars Partners, who also moderated that webinar back in November. So back in November, our panel, so there was discussion about individualized versus blanket, really agreed that that personalized approach rather than the blanket one is the way to go and is always better, although not always possible due to various factors, maybe regulatory reluctance and the tools that are available. So right now I'm just going to turn to our panelists and ask them to kind of give their background, their views actually on this topic and where the company sits when it comes to the discussion and actually the application of the personalized approach to customer protection and customer in general. And the question is also to the panel, do they see instances when more blanket approaches or caps are indeed needed? And I'm going to start with Avold. Over to you, Avold. Oops, we can't hear you.
There we are. Thank you for the introduction. I think I can answer this a bit from the regulatory perspective as well as from the operator perspective. At Video Slots, I think it's fair to say that we do actually have an approach which is quite personalized and individualized in these matters. And I think businesses actually have an interest in that, because you wouldn't want to have a large number of false positives that you focus your attention on. That would generate cost that has no benefits to consumers or regulators or indeed the company. So in the end, it pays to be precise. And that's an art, if not a science. It's not easy. It takes investment, but in the end, it is, of course, the best way to go. The question is always, how far do you want to go in terms of the effort to achieve that? And I think it's fair to say that we went quite far in that, because we saw the value in that, and that's probably also a matter of company culture. And I felt very much at home in that, because in a previous function, I was actually on the regulatory side, and that thinking that is in the quote, when I was working on the now finally to be introduced this year Dutch regulation in the Netherlands on the regulatory side, the thinking was very much along those lines, that it's always useful, of course, to give players information, to give them some tools, etc. But it's even more useful to be aware of what players should be approached directly and should be assisted more than by mere availability of tools. And that is why I think the Netherlands will actually this year be the first licensing regime, Europe if not the world, where the whole thinking about detecting players who are at risk and then interacting with them and offering them some assistance, where that actually is anchored in the actual law, not just in regulations or guidance, but in the actual law. And I think that's a good thing.
And we'll actually move on as well to discussing those regulatory attitudes. But I'm now going to turn to Brad to give us BCLC perspective, kind of more global perspective as well, I suppose, to when it comes to the individualized tailored approaches.
Thanks, Siwa, and good morning. BCLC was one of the first in North America to actually brand our what was then responsible gambling program as GameSense. So we have a long history of encouraging players to make their own decisions, take their own control, and set their own limits. Education and control are really the support that we want to offer players for them to get as much entertainment out of their experience as they can, and making it the healthiest and safest experience for every player, each player on their own terms. So we're very much in support of individualization. You know, one of the things that we've done over the past 3 or 4 years is shift actually away from responsibility in terms of branding and calling things responsible gaming. I work in the player health department. I don't work in the responsible gambling department, because it's a much more holistic way to look at all of the support we can offer players and all of the environments that we offer gambling in British Columbia. We're not just online. We offer several different options for players in terms of retail and casino facilities as well. And we do all of our marketing. So all of those things are very important to look at when we think about individualized messages and individualized experiences for players. So responsible growth is a very big key for BCLC corporately. It's in our charter, and we take it very seriously.
Thank you. And it's how you player health, and I think it's quite in line as well with what the Gambling Commission in the UK has been proposing for a couple of years now, which is actually to talk about safer gambling rather than responsible gambling. So I imagine it's kind of similar. Adam, over to you now. Where does TransUnion sit? Can you tell us more about what role you play in allowing or facilitating that personalized approach?
Thanks, Eva. Afternoon, everybody. Well, I mean, TransUnion is a starting point. We use the term information for good regularly. That's what we tend to base a lot of what we do on. So more information generally means you get a better picture of what an individual looks like. And we come at it from a supporting the operator, supporting the industry perspective, rather than a hands-on approach as opposed to the consumer itself. But when I was starting to look at our core values when we're developing solutions or products to support operators, it was interesting because we've probably got 5 that we always work to. And they've been largely driven by the operator's requirements, which are ultimately driven by the regulator requirements. And the first point there was individual. That's on an operator to operator basis. So whenever we're looking at helping with solutions or products to go into market, that's the first thing we need. We need it to be individual on an operator to operator, or for us, a client to client basis. I also thought that the other 4 points were really interesting as well. The second one was transparent. So it needs to be transparent for the operators. They understand what's happening, how something works, but also transparent for the regulator. So when an operator needs to demonstrate why they've made a decision, why they've onboarded an individual in a certain way, they can do that. Configuration is key. Things change on a daily, if not hourly basis for operators, consumers, behaviours change. Again, so that was our third point. Need to be easy to integrate. And again, we know there's more cost when there's regulation, solutions needed, and going into customer journeys means that it's harder sometimes to hold on to customers in that journey. And then the final part is the upgrade path. So actually being able to deliver solutions that aren't just going to fit for now, but are going to be flexible in the long term, because as regulation changes and again consumer behaviours change, those solutions have to be able to change with those times. So for me, if you think about all of those points, that basically means you need something that can be individual across lots of areas, not just a single approach for one.
Thank you. And a number of points here that we will be going back to. You talk about transparency for operator, for regulator. I think there's also transparency towards the consumer, and we'll talk about the interaction and player education as well, and flexibility, of course. How and those upgrades, right? And kind of adapting to what the future might bring. But I would actually like to now turn to the discussion about the regulatory attitudes and how do you anticipate that regulators move forward with this? Do you think, that regulators are going to start to warm up to this more personalized approach, or have, are they already there and actually it's going backwards? What are the obstacles in that process, so that indeed operators can kind of have more, introduce that and continue having that more personalized approach? Eva, I'd like to go to you, back to you with that question. I know you have some interesting thoughts, and you mentioned as well already kind of some of your thoughts on regulation. You're muted again.
I suppose it's going back and forth a little bit, and I think that's to be expected, because it is a difficult subject and often underestimated. Like I said before, it is possible, but not easy. And And that means that there will be some back and forth in the industry succeeding or partly succeeding, but not always to the degree that there would be no customers who have their views and their complaints. Media have an opinion on it. That spurs on politicians to look for quick solutions to a problem. Politicians generally lack the know-how that is present within regulators and within the industry to understand the intricacies of how do you motivate customers to participate in the efforts of regulators and the industry to achieve safer gambling. And what we see at the moment is that we actually have a regulatory environment in Europe which is harmonized on EU level, and even after Brexit, that still impacts on the UK as well, where anti-money laundering regulations are all about individualization of recognizing risk or not. And when you look at the way that the responsible gambling regulations have been drafted in the various countries, that is basically done in the same way. So that's also a risk-based approach. So from a regulatory perspective, we are already there. It's just that it's not always easy to do, and politicians seem to be getting impatient here and there. And we see in different countries, most recently Germany, that there are voices to actually impose blanket limits on the whole market. And that would be one size that should then fit all customers, but obviously it won't. And we are a very player-centric company. And that means that everything we do, we try to fit to the actual player. Because that is what the player is looking for. The player is an individual and is looking for entertainment. And when it's not only about entertainment anymore, the only way to get a customer on board in your efforts is to individualize it somehow. And we don't think that one size fits all measures are necessarily helpful. And we think that there are data in the market that actually support that. So from our point of view, it would still be better to individualize everything and not go the way of politicians looking for quick solutions.
Sorry, so you are kind of saying that regulation is actually there and we're going backwards due to the political pressures that are happening right now, right? So we're going from this individualized approach to more blanket rather than the other way around, as the technology allows that.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. That seems to be the case here and there. Yeah.
Why do you think that's the case? Why is that happening?
I think that is happening because politicians are not seeing the sort of reduction in harm that they are looking for. Whether that's right or wrong is open for debate. There are statistics that show that in the last many years, the prevalence of gambling addiction hasn't materially changed. There are others who are saying that there is such a material change. I cannot say that I know the facts better than anyone else. But what I can say is that there is clearly a degree of dissatisfaction amongst politicians as to the results achieved by now years of regulation. And they are looking to involve themselves and to achieve more. But as I said before, they very often have not studied all the intricacies of how to deal with the market of customers. And let's not forget, it's all about customer choice, isn't it? And consumers actually have a right to choose. That's what transparency in consumer law is all about. Mm. And that means that consumers can also choose to not play with regulated operators and to play elsewhere. And as a result, it's all about convincing the customer to be part of the efforts to make gambling safer. And
Yeah,
one-size-fits-all measures tend to not do that.
Yeah, I'd love to delve a lot more into this because there's a whole discussion here about public perception and obviously industry's role as well and the history and legacy of the industry. But let's kind of focus back on those regulatory trajectories. Adam, would you agree, as you see, we talked about the flexibility of the technology and solutions having to move forward and adapt. Would you agree with that there is kind of from a regulatory standpoint, we're there, but actually it's going backwards? Or how do you, obviously you have had to adapt as well to those regulatory requirements as they come in?
Well, I think what I can do is probably give you a view of what we see, and I suppose the information that we get from the regulator and from the operators. So we have a healthy dialogue with the regulator, and we have to have that because we need it to continue supporting our customers, which ultimately the operators. Now, we know because of the business we work globally, but we work very closely with other regulators from UK to Europe to the US. And we get a view of what they look for in data, what they look for in other sectors, other industries. And we know that the regulator now, UKGC, is having those conversations with those bodies in the UK also. So what they should be able to do is draw on parallels with other sectors, other industries. And if I look at what happens in other sectors and in other industries, I actually head up the e-commerce side of our business as well. We do a lot with the banks, the financial services side. Everything that's done in those industries is done on an individual basis. There isn't a blanket approach when you go to get a mortgage or a loan or finance or whatever it is you're purchasing online. So I think if they're having those conversations and looking at best practice elsewhere and what other regulators are doing, I'm sure that they'll take those learnings and apply them into the gaming sector, which hopefully means that will come through in an individualized approach when you're onboarding customers and when you're dealing with consumers.
So you have a more optimistic view on that transition towards more individualized than Ava, it sounds.
I tried to. I've seen similar things done in other sectors. I know it can be a steep learning curve for, I suppose, the companies that operate in sectors that have increased regulation, but also, like we just mentioned, consumers as well. So if I think back sort of 10 years ago when a lot of the high cost short-term lending businesses were popping up and different types of finance were available, there were some big shifts in consumer behaviours there, and that needed regulation. It needed managing, but it needed managing in the right way. So I'm certain that we'll get there. I'm certain it will play out in the right way for everybody.
Thank you. Brad, over to you. Could you tell us more about what it looks like in Canada and British Columbia when it comes to the regulatory environment, which I know is very different to the European environments that the other panelists operate in?
Yeah, so in Canada, each province regulates their own gambling in their own way. So each province treats it a little bit differently. In British Columbia, we have a government regulator, and I'm happy to tell everybody that we've always had a very strong relationship. BC has been online since 2004. And our regulator has always been fairly forward-looking. So we actually have very open language that makes us or requires us to do certain things for our online portal, and gives us the ability to implement that how we see fit or within cooperation with them. So we really, the language that they've used for us to guide some of the features and some of the reporting and other things that they want to see as a regulator has been quite effective, and it allows us to actually push forward with some of our programming without having to go back and get permission specifically or change any of the language and the requirements annually or more often than that. So our regime actually works quite well in British Columbia, thanks to a forward-looking regulator, and we had some key people in place with GPEB there. So I'm happy to say that it's not an issue that's raised its head here yet.
And because obviously it's a slightly different competitive environment, right? Does it mean that you don't have to worry about, you know, customers going next door, right? Going to your competitors? Can you explain a little bit more? Because this is very much kind of, you know, going into unlicensed markets is very much the fear that many operators express in Europe when it comes to kind of creating too many controls for the customers, for the players.
We still do. We have an unlicensed presence in Canada and in BC. So we still do have to worry about players playing, especially on the poker side, where liquidity of the big sites that do offer their sites in BC and in Canada. You know, that's a big attraction for players, and we do struggle with it. So we do have competition, especially online. It is a I won't say it's a going concern, but certainly it's something we're conscious of when we, on the business side of things. On the responsible gambling side of things, I don't think we do worry too much about it, because we know that implementing these programs is what's best for our players, and we use the data and we use the research to implement those programs. So we know that we don't really feel that we haven't seen the drop off, and I've got some data that I can present a little bit later on in terms of that. But it's not a, I wouldn't say it's a large concern for us, but certainly there is online competition in the marketplace that we're conscious of.
Thank you. That leads me actually to another question about to what extent that those controls, you know, individualized approach, tailored approach, but obviously also certain interference of the customers into the behavior of the player, of the operators into the behavior of the player. Can this be a competitive advantage? And it seems like it's very much your thinking at BCLC. Adam, I'm gonna go to you and ask you now about the customer onboarding process. And what does it look like? And can you see customers kind of, you know, appreciating the friction perhaps that comes with onboarding for the benefit of their protection?
Yeah, I think this for me is an interesting point, because obviously we work in the data software world, so we know what's available, what's doable, and what isn't doable essentially. But there are ways to onboard customers with a view of responsible gaming without causing too much friction. Well, again, if I just make parallels with other industries, you can get a mortgage or a loan probably in 5 minutes, and that could be fairly accurate in other sectors and industries. But the challenge within the gaming sector is actually the limitations around the data available. So I've mentioned that I know there are conversations going on, certainly from TransUnion's perspective, with the organisations in the UK that hold that data to try and open it up. But you can derive a fairly robust idea of what somebody looks like currently, but just not to the accuracy of some of these other industries. So what I mean by that is you can onboard an individual in an automated way by perhaps just asking a couple more questions. Now, that doesn't mean it's an easy thing for operators to do, because we understand that from, I suppose, the intel we get around the way consumers move between brands, the competition that's out there. There's lots of different elements that come into this, and like I mentioned previously, we know that there's a cost to all of these things on top of that. So you have to be very careful, and you have to kind of balance your view, but there are ways to get there, and there are ways to onboard customers currently without causing too much friction, but without putting the right controls in place. It's just understanding what data is available, but then also keeping one eye on the future and making sure that we are trying to open up that additional data that will make those controls even more robust.
Ewout, what are you seeing as an operator when it comes to customer onboarding and the points of friction that perhaps are too much and that are acceptable? And unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted, I think. I think the first question is what's part of the market you're actually targeting, and And I suppose that there are different market segments that will carry a different level of difficulty in terms of friction when it comes to safer gambling, responsible gambling. We on the whole, we target a market segment that is a lower risk, and we don't, for an example, target VIP players, and that already goes a long way. And I think that companies would do well in really considering what their business model is, because if you think, for an example, about VIP players, how many people in society make enough money to be VIP players? I mean, you could really make calculations as to the question whether your VIP player portfolio is actually realistic within society. And that might tell you something about whether you're really striving for safer gambling or simply trying to comply with regulations while continuing the old way of doing business. Now, when you then look at the customers and how they respond to the various questions that you might have on onboarding and after, etc., I think many customers would surprise you in not minding that much. Customers are looking for a safe environment, and if you are transparent and clear, they very often don't mind, and they might very well see the advantages in it. And you can then focus on the behavior of customers, which of course is the most telling thing in terms of risk assessment, and what information you need. You may not always be able to get from the customer, but the customer is of course a great source of information himself, if you again can convince the customer to be part of this. And customers who are not minded to be part of this, well, they might be lost to the company, they might be lost to the regulated industry, but there's a limit to what you can do about it if you want to conduct your business responsibly. So what it comes down to is, of course, you would like to reduce your friction in all possible ways, but clarity is probably the most effective way. And if then you do lose customers in the process, that may be something that you should simply accept as part of doing business. Yeah.
So are you of the view, I mentioned that kind of fear that some operators express when there's too many controls, perhaps, or threats of controls discussed by regulators and policymakers. And they talk about migration towards illegal markets. It seems like you're not that concerned about this. Do you think that customers are generally?
No, I'm actually very concerned about that, but not due personalized and individualized regulations. I'm very concerned about that due to threshold approaches, one-size-fits-all limits, and that sort of thing.
I see.
And I think that the industry in Europe is at risk of seeing channelization decline further if we continue on the path of quick and easy solutions. And I think we need to, as an industry, but also as a continent, we need to allow ourselves more to accept the complexity of it all, and to not try to keep things too simple and come up with one-size-fits-all approaches that actually don't fit anyone.
And actually, you mentioned clarity with the customers, and the customers don't actually mind to be asked, and that really leads me nicely to my next question. And I want to go to Brad with this question about player education and the communication with the players, and how to educate players about the need to introduce certain controls and to introduce those points of friction, so that they play safely. Brad, could you start on that?
Certainly, thanks. It's interesting that it almost sounds like Europe and BC are reversed in some fashion. We've always had friction on our our registration and our onboarding because one of our mandates and one of our regulations, you know, that's as old as we are, is that only players from British Columbia can register online, register to play online. And so we have always had to demonstrate and prove that the player registering is the player they say they are, they're over 19 years of age, and that they are a resident and located in British Columbia when they register. So we have always had friction that we've had to overcome in order to onboard our customers. So we've done, you know, we front load all of our KYC, and well, you know, we were envious of Europe for so many years because, oh, they don't have to do any of those things, and now that growing pain seems to be coming, and not that we were relaxed at all, but we've done it for so long now that it's just part of who we are. But in regards to player education, I mentioned GameSense at the top, and you know, GameSense was created really with the idea to take the clinical part of responsible gambling and player health out of the language and the methods that we use to talk to players. So GameSense talked to players and gamblers in their own language, and it removed judgment. And again, one of the reasons we're moving away from responsible gambling is because when you hit someone over the head with you have to gamble responsibly, it puts a lot of pressure on the player not to have any fun and be conscious of what they're doing. And instead we've moved to player health and a more holistic view, like I said. So GameSense was very important to that, and it's the umbrella we use for all of our messaging. And we, in our casino facilities across the province, we actually have people. We have GameSense advisors that are on the casino floor, and they have a dedicated office space on the casino floor that's welcoming. It's open. Players can come and read up on games. They can have a chat about their luck, or their winning or they're losing. And in our smaller communities as well, GameSense advisors really, people come and they'll drop by the GameSense booth when they come to the casino to say hi to their favorite advisor when they're on shift. And during COVID, obviously, we've lost that because our casinos have been shut down since March. And we took big steps to move those GameSense advisors online so they could talk to players, whether they were gambling on Play Now or not. Those players could talk to our players that normally played in casinos. If they were feeling isolated, or if they were feeling anxious, they could actually call and talk to their GameSense advisor on the phone or on a live chat. And that program was rolled out very quickly because of the situation with COVID and shutting down. But we've rolled it out to Play Now as well. So now gamblers that are online with Play Now can speak with a GameSense advisor about their gambling. They've hit a deposit limit or something else, and they want to reach out and have some contact with somebody. So we have that piece that it's not counseling, it's just an ear for people to listen to. And they can also help with education of how games work. Randomness is really just randomness. No one's mad at you today, and so you're not winning. It's a communication strategy, and we've seen really big impacts here in BC. So part of it, is being customer centric, but it really speaks to that individualization piece as well, that we have one-on-one conversations with our gamblers, and we can do that as part of our mandate. And I realize it's probably not a solution for everybody in Europe, but it's one of the things we're really proud of, and 13 different companies and jurisdictions have licensed the GameSense brand. So, we're in all of MGM's casinos right across North America. They've licensed our product, and we have several jurisdictions, state jurisdictions and provincial jurisdictions as well. So we really see GameSense as providing that education piece for us effectively and in a fun way.
Thank you. And I think the pandemic has really created kind of an unfortunate but I suppose useful context to talk about customer protection, right? Because there is this context of well-being and health, and add to this, protection as people play as well. I think it creates a good context to have that discussion, and for operators to kind of take more active role to have that discussion on a one-on-one basis as well with the players. Adam, I want to go to you as well, as obviously like you interact or through your technology with a lot of customers. Can you comment on that player education or communication? You ask players to kind of give certain information about them. Do you see that there's resistance? Do you need to communicate that in a specific way? And like obviously there's a lot of things that you have to do because of the regulation, and whether it's data privacy or other type of regulation. But what do you see when it comes to the interaction at the onboarding process?
Yeah, but I mean, just listening into Ewout and Brad, there were a couple of things there that resonated with me, which is got different brands, different offerings, different risk levels. So I think that the first thing I'd say is that that ultimately is going to drive different limits, different interactions when you're dealing with customers. So that's probably those two things there. Limited interactions is probably what we hear more about from the operators. But within the UK and to an extent Europe, although it's more difficult, we're quite data rich in the UK. You can derive quite a bit of information from an individual, a consumer, from name, address, date of birth, typically what you put on any application. So you can check for anti-money laundering, you can check for age, you can get an idea of somebody's affordability now. We're looking at income potentially. So there's a lot there. We've also obviously got our device element. So by picking up somebody's name, address, date of birth, and knowing their device from, we can link that to other devices we've seen. So there is a huge amount of data you can draw on without actually asking the customer to put in a lot of information. But that will only get you so far. The key from our perspective, from what we hear from the operators, is the combination then of what you've got from, I suppose, a third party or something like a TransUnion, and what you know about that player. So their playing time, how they're playing, and this is probably more to do with what Brad's talking about. Adam that's been online for, I don't know, 5 minutes, who lives in an affluent area, has checked out on his AML element, and looks very good from a credit perspective, it's probably okay to continue betting. But Adam, 16 hours later, who's deposited a huge sum of money, looks very different, and I think that's the key. So the messaging up front isn't too heavy at the moment. You can get quite a bit of information. I believe we should operators get more information, because that will better equip them to make decisions on those limits. But there's a bit of friction there, but not a huge amount. It's monitoring and understanding that player, how they're interacting with the platform, operator, all these different things. That's where I think you're probably going to have to educate consumers. And I would imagine those that are spending a lot of time in casinos, gambling, because that's what they enjoy. Again, this is a leisure product. So people go out for dinner sometimes, other people like to bet and have fun. If they have been gambling for some time and they understand what they're doing, then they're more than likely to expect some interaction and a little bit of friction there, perhaps. But it's just making sure that the message is probably consistent across the marketplace and it becomes something that's well known. And that probably goes back to Ewout's point about it's something the consumer's got to get on board with and understand, because there is an element of risk there. You don't go into a shop and buy alcohol without having to show some ID and perhaps being tested on that ID. And I think that's the same thing. Once as a population get used to that, it will be the norm.
Thank you. So we have 15 minutes left, and I just want to encourage again the audience to put forward some questions. I am seeing some questions already, and I'm kind of weaving them into the discussion that we're having. But if you want to add any specific question, then please use the questions functionality as part of this platform. And I just wanted to kind of follow up, stay on this customer topic, and ask about customer research. So obviously, there's like a lot of discussions about evidence-based regulation or evidence-based approaches. I'm curious whether your company plays have done or are doing any customer research that can kind of inform your decisions a little bit more about, you know, how much friction is possible, or how much friction is acceptable, like what the customers think, how much communication should take place. Brad, I think you mentioned at some point, you talked about those points of friction and that interaction with the customer, what the customer's views were on this.
Yes, and to some extent, it's unfortunate that, you know, some of the friction points for us aren't negotiable. So there's not a lot we can do to them, and we don't actually have mandatory limits or controls in place that players must use in terms of being mandated by our regulators. So we're fortunate in that respect. The restrictions or the requirements that we do have, such as residency and location, are just non-negotiable. So we do work to make them as seamless as possible. So one of the things that we used to do was require a credit card number during registration, and that was because we needed to confirm that the credit file, the person that was registering, was who they said they were, and we used that credit card number to easily look that up with our credit service. And we've been able to, as the tools have advanced, we've been able to remove that step. So people were concerned about, well, I don't want to use that credit card to deposit. I don't want to use a credit card at all to deposit. And we had to reinforce so you don't have to, but we do still need the number. We've removed that step. We have a weekly deposit limit that we do enforce. It's not a restriction per se for most players, but players were forced to enter that during the registration process, and we found that players were dropping off our registration flow at that point. So we actually moved that field out of registration and moved it to when the players deposit. So as a part of their deposit flow now, if they haven't set their limit, they'll be prompted to and have to before they can deposit for the first time. So those are the types of steps that we've taken, but we're not quite in the same boat as a lot of the regulated European jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm. Ewout, what about you and video slots? How have you adapted or had to adapt?
Well, I've done some analysis into this as well, and what really came out of that, in my mind, is that we can actually trust so many more customers than perhaps prejudices outside of the industry to control themselves. And I think that became clear last year as well, when the pandemic hit the world and hit Europe. That research conducted by academics consistently showed that players were able to control themselves, and the vast majority of players actually played less during the pandemic without being forced to. At perhaps even at the time when they had more opportunity to do so. And I think it's important to remember that at the end of the day, what we are looking for is to protect and help protect themselves a small portion of players, and that we should always balance what we do in that sense with what the large number of players need or don't need. And I think the fact that we can see in customers that they when they are informed that they can actually make good choices. I think we also see that back in we for example provide a lot of information about RTP, and that information is quite detailed, and what we can see is that really helps players to understand what Brett said before. This is a game of chance. That's what it is. It's not a way to make money or to become happy. It's a game, it's entertainment. And when you're upfront about that, people understand, people accept. And ultimately that removes friction.
Thank you. Okay, I want to move on to next question around affordability. There's been a lot of discussion over the last few months on affordability. I believe there's a consultation that's due to close or has closed by the Gambling Commission. You know, I remember when we held this webinar in November, we just had so many questions, we're inundated with the questions around affordability. So I just want to focus on this a little bit. Adam, can I go to you first? If you could comment, I know as part of your platform, there is an affordability solution as well. Where are we at with the consultation and with just adoption of affordability in general?
Yeah, so the consultation, you're right, is due to close. So that's imminent. I believe it's in the next couple of weeks, early part of February. In terms of affordability and the adoption that we've seen, we probably work with, in some respects, about 90% of the UK market. So I focus on UK just because that's what we know very well and where the solution was rolled out. But the adoption of the solution itself has been really good from our perspective. We would say that the majority of operators we work with are either using it and have had it in now, some of them for probably 18 months. If they're not using it, they've probably tested it and are in a good position to start using it in some way or some form within their business. But the really interesting thing for me on the use of the affordability solution is the way it has actually driven the interaction with customers. So some of the feedback we've had from the operators that have perhaps had it in a bit longer, those that have had it in for coming up to 2 years, is that they've adopted different strategies based on what we tell them up front. So they might use it as the first interaction. Now, as I say in my previous comment, a lot of this is done in the background. So the data, all you need is name, address, date of birth to be able to get to that. So from that, you can typically, if somebody's had lots of searches on their credit file, we have to be quite, I suppose, clever with how we use the data because it's restricted. But so there's search data in there, there's public level data, so CCJs, bankruptcies, insolvencies, generic scores involved in the solution. All these different things come together, and that ultimately is there for protection of, like Evat said, that very low percentage of people that might not want to be betting as much as they would normally. So if you're bankrupt, for example, should you really be betting at all? There's a question mark over that. So just going back to the original question, the adoption's been really good, and actually how they've implemented it has been really good from our perspective too. Been creative in some ways. We give, as part of our solution, a RAG status, so red, amber, green. And we've worked with lots of operators over the last 2 to 3 years to develop that out, but that's configurable. But we also give a score of 1 to 20, and we'll typically say, 1 probably shouldn't be betting at all. Bankrupt, got lots of issues going on, personally, financially vulnerable, there's issues there. 20, live in an incredibly affluent area, look very good from that perspective. But what some of the operators have done is said, well, actually, we know how these individuals play, the type of things they're doing, and your 3 looks more 4, and your 6 looks more like an 8. And they've tweaked it to adjust it to their customer base, their current controls, which they've worked on for years. They know their customers better than anybody. And that's the interesting part for me. So I think we've been pretty impressed with some of the things the operators have done. We're really pleased to see that it's been adopted quite widespread.
Ewout, your views on affordability and the rollout and I guess usability of it?
I think there's always a danger in the proposals moving in a direction of a threshold approach, which is not very individualized, and therefore will capture many people who do not need to be captured, and may not capture some people who do need to be captured. At the same time, I think that if the regulations are going to make very clear and explicit what really is expected across the board, then that's probably a good thing. As always, with purpose regulation rather than prescriptive regulation in detail, there's always the risk of a race to the bottom. The Commission has said that affordability is key in their future outlook on where regulation should go. And then I think it's good if it's made very clear what is affordable and not, when that needs to be checked and how. In sufficient detail to see a level playing field across all operators doing the same thing. So I see very good potential in that as such, but there are, of course, dangers in really achieving the effectiveness of reaching those players who need it most.
And do you think affordability again can be, can give a competitive advantage, right? So would an operator use affordability tools, whether it's required by regulation or not, right? Is there a value in having them anyway?
Oh, there is. We've looked at affordability for years now, and with our own tools that we introduce to players in excess of regulations, and we've seen mainly advantages from that. I wouldn't say that it is without cost, but as I said before, if you do want to achieve safer gambling, then that will come as a cost, at a cost, and you will have to accept that. Once you have accepted that, you can see all the advantages of it.
Thank you. Okay, we have 3 more minutes. I really wanted to also talk briefly about the kind of internal structure that can support more individualized approach. Are there kind of changes needed within the organizations, within the setup of the teams, staff training that are needed to allow for that more tailored approach? Brad?
We have, I think there's 2 pieces that BCLC has identified, and corporate principles that embed player health are one of the ways that we try to achieve it. It's those, when it comes from the top and it's in your corporate documents, and it's part of the CEO's message and all of the vice presidents, directors, when people talk the talk and they have it in their designs, that really fosters the change and the attitude within the staff. So that's what we've seen as important. We have several player health pieces that make up what we do at BCLC, and it's becoming more and more a way of life. And my team, my manager, my team at within player health is part of that, to foster those relationships within our business lines, our marketing teams, our product teams, so that they can make player health decisions at the core without making us the bad guy, or without coming to us to say, help me with this decision. They actually are proactive in making those healthy decisions early on in their purchasing processes. So management teams as well that support the science, support the research, understand what it means. All of those things are important, and change is important too. So sometimes we'll go on a path and we'll be doing something, and then research will come out to say that we need to make a change or adapt quickly to a new condition in the market. And so even if that means undoing some of what you've just spent years doing, if you have support at the management level and you believe in that research and that science, you will adapt and make those changes, even if they're expensive or they cost you money. And those are the pieces that we think help foster player health around the organization, because it's a fully team effort. You can't just have 2, 3, 5, 10 people sitting in a corner or working on their own, trying to make change when no one wants it.
Thank you. Ewout and Adam, if you don't mind, I'm just going to move on to the last question, just to close up. We are on the hour already, but I really want to ask that last question about the future of customer onboarding. And really briefly, what do you think it's going to be? Where are we going? And I'm going to start with Ewout. Yes, and your view on the future.
Well, I think where we are going is that customers will get really used to how this works. and they will find more and more normal. We've seen that already over the last years, that customers accept more and more that this is part of gambling online. And that will continue. At the same time, I hope that governments will step up a little bit in recognizing that if we're talking about a unified customer view, at the end of the day, considering also that some governments in Europe actually have player databases that are filled by operators, also have tax information from customers, etc. No party is in a better position to have a unified customer view than a government.
Thank you.
At the end of the day, we're talking about a problem in society, so it seems appropriate that governments solve that as well to an extent.
Fred, you are kind of part of the governmental organization, isn't it?
and we don't have that access that Ewout referenced either. So we're in the same boat. So I just completely echo those comments. I think that's a big piece.
And Adam, last word over to you to also finish the webinar.
Yeah, I think I'm a big advocate of the use of data. As you guess, working for TransUnion, we've got data globally on individuals that could really help and support with customer onboarding without causing too much friction. So I think from my perspective, it's there and it's going to continue. I just think we all need to work together to ensure that it's done in the right way, the right controls are in place. But I'm certain we'll get there.
Well, thank you so much. Big thank you to all and three of our panelists today. Big thank you to TransUnion as well for their support with this webinar. Thank you to our audience for your questions and for your participation. I'm sure we will continue talking about this topic as it evolves. But thank you very much for your participation today. And remember, it has been recorded, so you will be able to listen to it or share with others. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.